yeah, and I did manage to catch Francisco's wonderful paper last week, and hopefully you'll see some of the parallels, which I'll talk more about in a moment. So yeah, just as very, very briefly about me and my research, I finished my DPhil here in Oxford in spring of last year. And my project was titled The Mozarabs and Their Neighbours, a study of the Arabic documents of Toledo, focusing on a study of the Arabic-speaking Christian population of Toledo in the aftermath of the conquest of the city from its Muslim Taifa rulers by Alfonso VI of Leon Castile in 1085. So in my own research, I'm principally concerned with what happens to the Arabized Christian population of Toledo when the city passes from Muslim into Christian hands. I was also particularly focusing on the kind of process of Castilian colonization of the Taifa Kingdom of Toledo and the process of settlement in and around the city, which was affected by a highly pluralistic population of Christians, Muslims, and Jews who came from all parts of the peninsula to settle and cultivate the land outside the city. So these Arabic-speaking Christians in Toledo come to be known as the Mozarabs. You may see them referred to as such in the literature. And what is distinctive about them is the way that they sustain quite a rich Arabic culture in Toledo for about 2 centuries after the conquest, which is somewhat unprecedented when we think about other parts of the peninsula that were brought into Christian control. Typically, Arabized Christian populations acculturated really quickly to the new kind of Castilian milieu, and Arabic dropped out of usage as a language of administration or indeed of literature, typically sustained by Jews in some of these places. But in Toledo, we have a really vibrant kind of Arabic-speaking culture that persists through the 12th and into the 13th, well into the 13th century. This term Mozarab, I'm not going to go into this. It's a slightly problematic term in the literature. It comes from the Arabic, meaning to have become like the Arabs, Mustarab. But it's kind of often applied in quite an imprecise and slightly problematic way, which I'm happy to talk about in questions. It implies a kind of coherent community of Arabized Christians in Toledo after 1085, and I'm not convinced that that's the case. And indeed, what we see over the course of the 12th century are successive waves of migration to Toledo from Arabic-speaking populations from the south of the peninsula. So this is there's a kind of broader Arabized milieu which encompasses Arabized Christians who may have been there prior to the conquest and their descendants, converts to Christianity from Judaism and Islam, Christian migrants from different parts of the peninsula across the 12th century. So this is quite a diverse community of Arabic-speaking Christians. And more broadly, we have Jews and Muslims who also use Arabic, who are present in the city at that moment. So it's a really interesting mix of different Arabized populations. One of the things that is evident, though, from that kind of very, very quick potted history is that Toledo is a place that actually does sustain connections with the south of the peninsula after its conquest. And I suppose one of the things that I hope to convince you of today is that Toledo, this moment of 1085 is seen too often as a breach with the past. And that actually we can see over the course of the 12th century, these successive waves of migration that mean that Toledo itself is shaped in many ways by these Christian, Jewish and Muslim communities in other parts of Al-Andalus. So this idea of sort of Toledo in 1085 suddenly passing into a completely new world, I think, is a sort of implicit assumption in some of the scholarship that we need to think quite carefully about. So my PhD focused on a set of documents from Toledo produced by these Arabic-speaking Christians. This is a rich resource, which I'll talk about in much more detail in a moment. There's about 1,175 documents produced by mostly Christian Arabic notaries across this kind of 2-century period. And the kind of documentary culture that they oversee is notable for its the way in which it's embedded in documentary traditions that come from the Islamic world. So the Toledan notaries, although they're Christian, developed their documentary culture following the principles of Maliki law. In fact, there are notarial manuals produced in the mid-11th century in Toledo that these Christian notaries continue to follow.
Just note, Helen, that all of our online viewers are viewing through that.
Okay.
You don't need to look here.
Okay, thank you. That's great, thanks. So these documents I came to principally at the beginning because I was interested in the sort of socioeconomic history of the city. I was concerned with the sort of rich social data that you can take from them, and interested in the way in which we can use these documents to tell a story of interreligious interactions in this period. But I soon realized that in order to actually read them, I needed to understand how they'd been put together and what kinds of legal regimes they were operating under. And this occupied me for a large portion of my PhD research. What I've been trying to do in part since I finished the PhD is to try and think about how we place this Arabic documentary culture that is being produced and sustained and developed within a Christian context, within the kind of wider intellectual landscape of the 11th and 12th centuries in the Iberian Peninsula. Last week, we heard from Francisco and the absolutely wonderful research that is being done currently on Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas, this canon law compilation that is translated into Arabic dating to the mid-11th century. This is the kind of big publication that came out last year, was published after my PhD, but I found it to be really stimulating in helping me think about where these documents and the kind of documentary culture that developed in Toledo should be placed in relation to the wider context of the Iberian Peninsula and kind of Arabic, Christian Arabic in the wider Iberian Peninsula. So what I want to do today really is to take a cue from Lev Weitz, who in that kind of body of work brought into comparison some of the work that's been done in the Mashriq, where documentary sources, so things like contracts and letters and records of disputes, the kind of wider documentary corpus that exists in Egypt, are being put into conversation with some of the legal texts. So this is what I've been trying to sort of think about, and I've been very much inspired by some of the recent work that's come out of from scholars who are working on Al-Andalus. There's maybe a kind of an immediate question might be, well, what do these documents which are produced largely under a Castilian regime have to tell us about what's going on under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus for these Christians? And here I'm taking inspiration from a number of research projects, some of which are going on in Oxford right now, in which documents that are found in caches on what we might call the peripheries or the frontiers of the medieval Islamic world can actually really help to inform us about documentary cultures in medieval Islamic societies. So I want to make the case here that actually the documents from Toledo really can inform us about the situation for Christians living under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus. And I hope to elaborate that in what follows. But I would welcome your insights into and kind of criticisms of that as an approach, because I'll speak a little bit more about how I think we should read these documents in order to sort of illuminate perhaps the what comes before 1085. So the two main projects in Oxford that I'm thinking about, one's focusing on documentary sources. Many of you will know of them. Invisible East, which is looking at Iran and Central Asia and documentary sources there. But particularly, I think, relevant for the Iberian collection is the work that's been done on Sicily, where we have similar caches of Arabic, actually documents in multiple languages that come from the Norman court in Sicily. So I think this is a moment in which these caches that sort of exist on the peripheries of the Islamic world can really help inform us and contribute to the broader conversation about the place of documents in medieval Islamic societies. So to the collection itself. This is González Palencia, who is a scholar who edited the large collection of Arabic manuscripts found in Toledo Cathedral and other religious institutions. They constitute a really rich resource for the study of the economy and the society of the city in the period after its conquest in 1085. So the collection comprises mostly private commercial contracts, primarily detailing the transfer of land and other types of property, providing a window onto a really broad cross-section of society in the 12th and 13th centuries. Here we see the activities of a range of Christian communities. So Arabic-speaking Christians in Toledo lived alongside, closely alongside, worked together with different Christian communities from other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, and some even as far as France, who were brought to the Iberian Peninsula by Alfonso VI. So this body of sources really does help us reveal the economic interactions between individuals and families. But it's also, I think, a reflection of a really interesting documentary culture. A documentary culture that draws its structure and form from notarial manuals produced in Al-Andalus in the middle of the 11th century. So these Shurut manuals that are produced in Al-Andalus, there are two main manuals that are used as models, and we can trace, other scholars have I think observed this as well, which is that we can trace really closely the connections between the formula outlined in these manuals and the way in which they're being deployed in these texts is remarkably consistent across the 2 centuries after the conquest of Toledo. The collection includes mostly, about half of them are bills of sale, straightforward kind of contracts relating to sales. More concern donations or loans. There's several documents related to surety for credit, a number of wills, the records of disputes that are resolved by local magistrates, manumissions, exchanges of property. There's all kinds of things represented in there. They have typically been ignored, I think. They've been subject to a few important studies. Jean-Pierre Molinat has produced really important work on these documents, Diego Olstein. And more recently, I think they're starting to come into view as historians are more and more interested in the documentary record from medieval Iberia. Rocio Dago Portillo has been transcribing and producing wonderful editions of some of the documents and has contributed as well some important insights in relation to how they fit with kind of both Islamic and Visigothic law, which I'll talk about shortly. What I want to do for you today is to talk a little bit about the structure of these documents, and I hope that this will then bring them into conversation with the material that Francisco was presenting last week. As Stephen and I were talking just before the paper, and I think that there's really fabulous research that is coming out at the moment on the literary and theological output of Christians in Al-Andalus. We're starting, I think, to understand a lot more about these Christian Arabic texts and what this can tell us about the broader community. But this research is still somewhat siloed. There's a need to bring together, I think, different parts of this research in order to develop a more holistic picture. And what I hope to do is kind of convince you that the documentary record can offer us really interesting insights into how it was that Arabic-speaking communities in Al-Andalus were appropriating and negotiating with Islamic legal systems. And so what I want to do is take you through a little bit of the structure of the documents, think about the kinds of language that they're using, and make some comparisons with the things that Francisco was talking about last week, particularly focusing on the use of the word sunnah, which appears in almost every document in the collection. Then I want to take you through a specific example that I hope will sort of allow us to see the potential of these documents for informing our understanding of how kind of judicial processes might have been occurring within Al-Andalus. And finally, I'll kind of pull it together and look forward to hearing your contributions afterwards. So to start with, I thought we could begin by thinking about some of the language that's used in the sources and the structure of the documents themselves. So some text, I know it's a lot of small text, but I'll go through some of it in detail. So as I've said, the documents produced by Arabic-speaking Christians in Toledo conform remarkably closely to the standards and norms of document production found in Islamic Iberia and through the wider Islamic world. They closely adhere to the conventions established in Muslim notarial manuals written in Al-Andalus in the 11th century. And it's particularly striking how consistently they follow these models. The only substantial, so there's one document in the collection that is produced before the Christian conquest. It's made on the eve of the Christian conquest in 1083. It's a sale contract between a Jewish woman and a Jewish rabbi and a Muslim woman. And the only substantial difference in structure and form between that document in the collection and other sale documents produced later is the substitution of the Islamic calendar for the dating system. So they use the Spanish era dating system. And the use of the phrase al-sunnat al-nasara, according to Christian law or custom, and I'll come to sunnah in a moment, in place of sunnah al-muslimin. So there's a substitution of the legal regime that's being cited to support the structure of the document, but other than that, the later sale contracts match their Muslim antecedent almost to the letter. So this term sunnah, I think, has been there's I think increasingly we're understanding the particular capaciousness of this term when it's being deployed in Arab Christian settings. And I think Francisco's work on this in relation to Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas has really demonstrated this quite capacious usage. I'm following Rocio Dagapotillo on this, in particularly thinking about sunnah as denoting a set of collective norms or practices rather than the kind of term Sharia, which we might consider to be used here. And Francisco has written some really interesting, has provided some really interesting context around how this relates to the translation of materials in Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas. In the text, sunnah is used in a variety of ways, concerning custom, law more generally, broader sets of customary religious norms, and can be used either to denote a particular revealed law or kind of a broader kind of inherited tradition. Rodrigo Garcia Velasco has also compared this usage with what we see in the Latin documents, the fueros that are issued in Christian Iberia in this period, where we have a similarly capacious idea of local custom, which appears throughout the fueros. So I think it's quite clear that the kind of lexical, or the sort of semantic world in which we're operating here is denoting kind of sets of customs and ideas that are that have been appropriated in this kind of similar way. So Dagapotillo has, I think, argued convincingly that sunnah ought to be considered using this notion of kind of broader inherited tradition, and that's what we see appearing in the documents in Toledo. So every document in the collection appears with kind of the standard kind of invocations that we might find in Christian Arabic documents all over the Islamic world. It's always the basmala, but there are other pious formulae that are adopted from other Islamic traditions, from other documentary kind of cultures across the medieval world. This is remarkably consistent across all the documents in the collection, and I think, yeah, as being kind of dealt with elsewhere, so I won't dwell too much on that. What is more interesting is the structure of the documents themselves. So the vast majority of the sale contracts in the collection begin with an act of purchase or sale. And this is quite different from documents produced in the Eastern Islamic world, because the sale contracts from Toledo tend to open with either the verb ishtara, kind of purchase, or sometimes ba'a, rather than announcing the contract with kind of hadha ma ishtara. So this is different from other parts of the Eastern Islamic world, but it closely follows the models that we find in Andalusi formularies, in which the transaction's framed in the past tense as a sort of testimony of the witness to the sale, which has already been accomplished. This is notable because it's really different from the way that sale contracts are drawn up in Latin Christian societies of this period, in which the contracts are kind of drawn up in the present tense, describing the action of the sale itself. So this kind of structure of how the transaction is being presented very much clearly follows the sort of standard formulae and processes of documents from elsewhere in the Islamic world, but with a particularly Andalusi or inflection. The first section of each document also describes the property and the goods that are being transferred. The case that I've got here describes the sale of a corral, which is a quarter for animals, and the property is described by sort of situating it in relation to all the other properties that surround it. So it says it's bordered in the east by the house of Chatanin, who's the buyer, in the west by the road, in the north by an open alley, and in the south by the house of the heirs of someone. So they've identified all of the properties around it. Something, again, quite curious here, because documents in Islamic, from other Islamic documents would typically start by describing the, sort of what appears in the south first and go around in that way, whereas almost all the Christian ones tend to start in the east, which is notable, I think, a notable difference. Again, this kind of very formulaic structure closely follows what we find in the notarial manuals. There are a number of transfer clauses which are adopted. I've given some examples here, but these concern the kind of release of rights and the validity of the transaction. They often specify the price, and then there's a series of formulae relating to the transfer of money and property rights. So what we see here, just is basically sort of like the buyer paid the completed amount to the aforementioned sellers. They took it from him, exonerated him of all of his responsibility. He was exonerated. And what's significant here, what I've highlighted in red, is they did this according to the law of the Christians regarding sale, purchases, and warranty. So this is, I think, law is we're often translating sunnah as law here, but I think following Dagaputio, this should really be considered as custom. But every document in the collection contains this kind of vocabulary in these formulae. And then we have the witness clauses. So, and again, what we see here is the impact not only of Islamic formulae, but also in some cases, the use of Visigothic legal structures and Visigothic law, which seems to govern the necessity for witnesses. There's some differences according to different document types, depending on which witness clause is being used. But what we have here reflects both what we find in some of the Islamic notarial formularies, and in other cases seems to draw particularly on Visigothic law. So these documents themselves are kind of quite difficult to navigate because they appear to be drawing on different legal and documentary frameworks. Indeed, Jean-Pierre Molyneux argued that he thought that the sort of Islamicization of this documentary tradition was pretty superficial. I think kind of a cosmetic veneer. And and that actually what these documents reflect is a Visigothic tradition that was sustained under Islamic rule. But I think if this is the case, then it's really difficult to account for the fact that all of the contracts in the collection really do closely adhere to the guidance and models that we find in the Shurut manuals produced under Islamic rule. There are notable differences. There's a really helpful article by Dago Portillo on marriage and the ways in which inheritance law is operating differently in some of these documents. And I've also done some work on that myself. And I think that where we see divergences from the formularies is typically in areas of inheritance, particularly concerning women. So I think that's one area where we can see divergence. But apart from that, it's very clear, I think, to me at least, that these are produced in line with principles of Maliki law. It seems that what we're looking at in these administrative practices is a kind of customary law that draws on multiple sources. The Visigothic law code, local custom developed under Islamic rule, Islamic law, and so they're just a very interesting set of customs and norms that seem to have been developed within a particular context. Another area where Visigothic law is we see the impact of Visigothic law on Mozarabic commercial practice is in some of the documents that record disputes over property. So there's a case in 1192 in which Visigothic law seems to be explicitly called upon as a framework to resolve a quite complex situation pertaining to an inheritance. Basically, someone called Don Bitra dies, leaving his wife Shamsi, their 5 sons and 1 daughter, and there's a dispute between the children and their mother on the share of the inheritance. What's notable about this case is that it explicitly calls upon the Visigothic law code, in which women are entitled to inherit an equal share to their siblings. Unlike, for example, we might find in Islamic law where female descendants only inherit half of what's apportioned to male heirs. This is further complicated by the rights of widows accorded within Visigothic legal systems. So Shamsi outlived her husband, so they held a lot of property in common, and there's a kind of need to disentangle all of these quite complicated aspects of inheritance. So what's clear from this case is that Muslim inheritance and family laws clearly are not applying to the judgments that are being reached by the Alcalde in this case. And the Visigothic law code has been used as a reference point. So what should we make of all this? I think, why am I talking to you about documentary sources when we're supposed to be thinking about the kind of ways in which Christians are engaging with Islamic law in Al-Andalus? I've been really struck as I've been working with Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas and thinking about some of the canon law texts by the similarities in vocabulary and concepts that are being deployed here. And I think that one of the things that struck me in Lev White's contribution to the collection that I referred to earlier is this idea that there's a kind of Christianized fiqh that's being developed under Islamic rule. I tended to think of these documents as sort of picking up an Islamic tradition that would have typically been dominated by Muslim notaries kind of prior to the conquest, to that being then picked up by Christian notaries after the conquest. But actually, that's always posed a great number of questions for me, because how is it that these notaries are so well trained? They're not simply aping these formularies, they are engaging with them intellectually. And so what I'm interested in thinking about is how perhaps the documentary culture that is in Toledo in the early part of the 12th century is actually being shaped by this broader intellectual milieu that we can observe in a wider range of Arabic Christian sources. And so I think bringing the documentary material together with the kind of the canonical texts actually does us a favour in 2 regards. It can help us to understand how this documentary tradition developed after the conquest of Toledo and the kind of Christian community that sustained it. But I think it can also help contribute to our wider understanding of the kind of the lexis and the intellectual milieu in which Arabic-speaking Christians in Al-Andalus were engaging with different aspects of Islamic law. So I want, just for the sort of last section of my talk, to kind of bring out one particular case. I just lost my notes on this. So this is a document that I've found particularly interesting because of its the kind of materiality of the document itself. As you'll see, what we have here are actually 3 different manuscripts stitched together. It concerns a dispute dating from the early part of the 12th century, so we're really not far after Toledo has been taken into Christian hands. This comes as part of my sort of interest in how Arabic-speaking judges or magistrates were engaged to resolve disputes, especially in the first couple of generations after the conquest of Toledo. So this case is one of the earliest recorded in the collection, and it offers a glimpse of early efforts to settle property disputes, telling us a lot about the procedures that were followed in order to authenticate property transfer. So the case is a sort of it concerns people from multiple different constituencies, we might say. A Castilian deacon named Martin, and it concerns the ownership of a house in the cathedral quarter in the city of Toledo. So the case goes, I've put a little summary of the chronology here, just to follow. At an unspecified time in the past, we don't quite know when this happened, a fellow called Yaquis Gomez, the lord of the castle of Mura, instructed the Zalmedina, Juan Rodmirez, to gift a house to 2 of his followers, Mikhail Bilitis and Sanja Carlun. So these are, here we have Juan, who is giving a house each to 2 of his followers as reward for good service. Both of these houses are located in the cathedral quarter in the city of Toledo, and in particular, Sanja Carlun is recorded as having lived in the house until his death in the service of the king. So after his death, Sanja's heir, who is the aforementioned deacon, Martin, laid claim to the property. And in May 1114, he presented himself before the Consejo and the Alguacil Alcalde with a document written in Latin that recorded the gift made by Juan Rodmirez, which is signed by multiple witnesses. At this point, the Alcalde deemed that this was insufficient proof of ownership. So the Alcalde who hears the case is identified as Imran, and he then goes and confers with another senior magistrate, Abu al-Hassan Hatim, and the Zalmedina, who is Abu Zayd bin Harith. And they all decide that in order to authenticate this, they have to call all of the original witnesses to the Latin document in front of the Consejo in order to confirm the contents. So all 6 witnesses are found and called to testify, and this kind of satisfies the officials and confirms that Martin is the legitimate owner of the property. What's interesting is that this is recorded in sort of 3 separate documents. So we have first one you see on top is the dated October 1114, and this contains a testimony that Gomez had wished to bestow 2 houses on the 2 named individuals. The second is in Latin, and it's not dated, but it's Juan Rodmirez's testimony that he had enacted the gift. And the third details the procedure of the case, the decision of the alcaldes, and the process by which they come to their decision, and it explicitly affirmed Martin's right of ownership over the property. And then the 3 manuscripts are kind of stitched together, so in this kind of way that you can see here, to provide a kind of full, complete record of everything that's been said. So I think this is an instructive case for a number of reasons. They're responding to a need to regulate disputes around property transfer in the decades after the conquest of Toledo. And in particular, we see the alcalde going to great lengths to trace and affirm the history of the ownership of the property from the time of the conquest. The original written testimony of the gift is not considered to be sufficient proof, that the property had indeed belonged to San Giancarlo, and that's why all the witnesses have to be called before the alcaldes to confirm their testimony. This reflects an interest in the emphasis placed on the act of witnessing within the Islamic legal framework that governs the production of the contracts. And it indicates that the alcaldes want to be absolutely certain that the transaction adhered to appropriate custom and norms. There's a kind of preference for physical witnesses that is observed in many of the cases in the 12th century, which I won't go into here, but which we could, which it's very clear that where they can, alcaldes tend to call witnesses and relevant parties to confirm their transactions and swear to the veracity of the documents that they've written, that they've witnessed. So there's a kind of interesting intersection here between kind of oral and documentary cultures that I think reflects practices that we might see in the Islamic world. This doesn't mean, though, that the written record isn't important. On the contrary, the three manuscripts are kind of stitched together, preserved as a whole, as a kind of record of the history of the property. And that they're kind of made ready to be deployed as legal instruments when necessary, and then passed on if and when the property changes hands. So I think what we can see here is, there's a kind of documentary culture that there's an example here that tells us a little bit about the way in which documents were instrumentalized within this broader documentary culture, and how that intersected with processes of oral testimony. And yes, there's very much an emphasis on these sorts of customary practices in which we have an oral and documentary tradition that intersects in these moments within these cases. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is the kind of officials that are involved in the ruling. We have three kind of principal officials: the Alguacil Alcalde, who's named Imran, a more senior Alguacil Alcalde, Abu al-Hassan Hatim, and the Zal Medina, Abu Zaid bin Harith. And then they're also then required to testify in front of another figure, Martin Garcis, about whom we know very little, but who was probably a member of the Consejo. So we have kind of four officials, all of varying rank, who are mobilized to ratify what should have been a fairly straightforward claim regarding, the passing on of a property. The alcaldes and other officials worked in teams. There's a clear hierarchy among them. The case was initially brought before the Alguacil Alcalde Imran, who was then described as deputizing for one of the other alcaldes, who later comes to a judgment in a kind of collaborative way. I think this is really interesting, and in the absence of other good data to help us figure out how some of these judicial processes might have occurred under Islamic rule, I think we can use this as a model, actually. Multiple officials, sometimes representing different communities, especially in that moment after the conquest of Toledo, tended to be used to resolve disputes in a kind of, often in a really collaborative way. There's an emphasis on consensus and agreement within these processes that we see throughout the documents from Toledo. There's an awareness here that any potentially controversial cases need to be resolved in the public eye. There's an emphasis here on the performance of justice, the performative nature of the office of the alcalde in this respect. And I think that something particular that we can learn from this example, especially if we, as I've said, if we kind of consider that, it's my feeling from looking at the documents that emerge in the beginning of the 12th century, that this documentary culture is clearly not appearing out of the blue. Neither is it necessarily just completely aping a pre-existing Muslim documentary system. So it's highly likely that the first document in the collection, 1083, seems to have been produced by a Muslim notary. But I think we also have to accept the possibility that Christian notaries are operating in the 11th century in Toledo, following their own particular documentary culture that's embedded and rooted in Islamic law and systems of Islamic law, but that has its own kind of Christianized inflections. And I suppose one of the things that I'm interested in doing, and this is still, obviously I'm kind of moving towards thinking about some of these other texts from Al-Andalus, but to think about how we can bring together these different texts and think about how they may have been interacting. So where to situate these documents? We have very little good information that helps us to understand the notarial culture that dominated in Toledo in the aftermath of the conquest. But what we can learn from these documents is, I think, there are some things that we can kind of glean from the contents of the documents. And that is about the process through which justice and cases like these might have been heard from alcaldes. There's an assumption, I think, that's not quite right, and I'd be interested to discuss this with others who might have other ideas, but that these notaries worked out of the cathedral. I don't think there's very good evidence to suggest that these the alcaldes and their scribes were working out of the cathedral. And in fact, in later documents, we have information that tells us that alcaldes were hearing cases in the porticos of particular churches. So I think what we have here is a kind of fairly informal and itinerant notarial culture that responds to local need. And again, I'm interested in what that might tell us about how Christian communities were operating prior to the conquest, especially those that were concentrated around particular churches. I think if the Arabic-speaking notaries were working out of the cathedral chancery, we'd expect to find more traces of their activities within the existing cartularies and the cathedral archive itself. Instead, the documents that do appear in the cathedral archive tend to appear there because the properties that they're associated with were eventually appropriated by the cathedral, not because I think there is a kind of particular, the cathedral itself is a centre for document production of this kind. I'm conscious of time, so I will draw to a close. I think what I'm trying to do in thinking about how we can bring together the canon law sources and the documentary material is to approach this question of Christian engagement with Islamic law in a slightly more holistic way. What we've seen from the canon law collections and the research that is coming out of the wider project on Al-Qanun al-Muqaddas is that Arabic-speaking Christians were engaging with kind of Islamic thought in quite sustained and complex and rich ways. And I think that this also is reflected in the broader social practices that come out of this process. So even though these documentary sources are created after the conquest, I think they have a great deal to tell us about the legal, judicial and political landscape that Andalusian Christians were operating in. I don't mean to suggest, though, that this is a kind of fossilized tradition. And actually, one of the challenges of reading these documents is that they represent a kind of responsive documentary culture. This is a living tradition that continues to respond to need after the conquest. But fundamentally, it points to an Arabic Christian culture with a history of sustained engagement with Islamic documentary culture. I'll leave it there. Thank you.